Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Horizon podcast, where we continue to bring you fantastic insight from industry specialists and experts who can help you to grow your international trade, as well as the insights and real life experiences from business people who have successfully traded across the globe. Today, I'm joined by an individual who, as a businessman, has not only traded and travelled across the world with work, but has been involved in supply chains that have touched every corner of the globe. And today, we'll dive into how he not only created these international connections, but nurtured them to help him become one of geothermal industry's leading voices. Enjoy the show. Hello, I'm Ben, and thank you for joining us today for what I'm sure will be another fantastic conversation as we delve into the vast experience of today's special guest. I'm delighted to be joined by Karl Farrow, who, among plenty of other roles, is the founder of Geothermal Energy Development Company and CeraPhi. In a career covering more than 4 decades, Karl has worked across Europe, East Asia, America, and Mexico, and has a wealth of experience and knowledge in market strategies and building strong international networks to deliver both services and products. Thank you very much for joining me this morning, Karl. How are you doing?
Very well, Ben. Thanks very much for having me on.
No, not at all. And thank you very much for agreeing to be on and join us today. It's always great to get someone who's done it all in the way that you have.
Thanks.
So I'll dive kind of right in then. And to be honest, first question builds a little bit on what I mentioned there in that you have worked across the globe in different countries and you've built those connections in these different countries as well. And there's people and there's businesses out there who, to be honest, are struggling to do that with just one market or one country, and would love to have that strong connection that you've managed to build up, but don't really know where to start and how to go about it. So I suppose kind of going back to the beginning of your experiences, how did you kind of get your foot in the door almost? How did you start building those connections?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of sort of different ways to look at this. Timing opportunity is obviously key. The stage in your life when you're doing it, or the stage of a business when you're doing it. Fortunately, I left the UK fairly young. I sort of started working overseas quite young, through effectively within an apprenticeship. But also more or less after that, straight away, I was working overseas in the trade I was in as a sort of mechanical fabricator and in the oil and gas industry. And that took me into mostly Europe initially, and some parts of the US, and sort of Houston and Louisiana early on. Um, but I think the appetite to move overseas was really, for me, about opportunity. And I would say the first sort of drive for me was really, you know, uh, the turning point was sort of just before the millennium. I really decided the oil and gas industry was sort of like coming on and up to a certain extent, after being in a down for quite a long while. And because of that down, I'd been involved with a number of larger projects overseas. So I had an opportunity through the early 90s to sort of work on a few projects in northern Spain, sort of first generation FPSOs, etc. And I knew that there was, a boom coming. Decided I just wanted to do something different. So I packed my wife and kids in a Fiat Punto and drove down to the south of Spain. And sort of rocked up in a contacts or a friend's area that I knew down there. And really, that's where I started my first business. And I think that was, I would say, a bit pro or reactive response, but also I knew that there was an opportunity there based around the shipyards and based around the fabrication yards that were down in that area. And that's really, I then spent a sort of focused target point on them areas to actually try and develop business. And I think, what I'd learned previously by working abroad is that, I had fortunately learned some Spanish. That's key. You've got to, try and speak and understand the dialect that's being used in that country. It's very easy, if it's an English speaking region. But then you've still got to, understand the culture. But I think, for me, it was really about, I knew there was an opportunity. I felt confident enough that I had a little bit of language skills in there. I'd already, understood a bit of the market from working on a few projects there, and decided to really take a dive into that market, knowing that there was a potential, huge explosion of work going to happen down in that region. So that was the initial sort of driver. And it varies from different types of companies and people. But I'm sure you've got other
Mhm.
questions.
Well, I suppose building on that one, I suppose some people would say kind of picking up the whole family, sticking them in the car and going down there, that's the extreme of one way of doing it.
Yeah.
But I know from you touched on it and speaking to people kind of previously how there is no substitute for actually putting your feet on the ground in whatever market it is, doesn't matter which market you're trying to break into. And maybe people have lost that a little bit since COVID and after COVID, but um, I presume for you that's still exactly the case that, yeah, Zoom, Teams, that can go so far, but you've got to put your feet on the ground.
Yeah, I think it's like everything, whether it's setting up a business, expanding a business, growing a business, even in the domestic market, it comes with a sacrifice. And that sacrifice to a certain extent can be, chucking your kids and the wife in a car and driving to another country, or it can be, dedicating a significant amount of time and resources to actually develop a specific market. And I think that's what a lot of companies, I think, underestimate is just because something sells good in your market or you're a leader in the field in your market, say you're going to be the leader in the field in another market overseas without putting in the same work and effort that you've already done where you are. Um, so I sort of look at it as like, you're climbing different mountains, doing the same thing, but you still got to climb that mountain to get to where you want to get to in a Pacific market. It's not easy. And I look at it as sort of three key areas. You've got there's a sacrifice bit with the timing and opportunity. You've then got, the localization. You've got to understand that market, understand the business culture in that market, and effectively become local. Become very localized, sort of needed sort of resource in that
Mm.
market. There's no good going over to a place that is a world leader in manufacturing valves and trying to sell valves. It's not going to work out well from a business point of view. But I've seen it happen, and I've seen companies try to do that, and with disastrous results, obviously. But I think you also got to, when I was doing this back, 25 years ago now, when I first jumped in the car and set up my first business, that we didn't have internet, we didn't have all the tools that are there that you've got today. So I think in a big advantage, the world's changed very positively through the likes of, incidents like COVID, and we can, people are used to talking online now and talking over, various different medias. And you have lots of tools at your disposal now to do a lot of upfront DD and sort of due diligence on market, entry and market factors that, weren't around when I sort of first kicked off. So you had to be in that local environment really to understand it and work with it. Whereas today, I don't think you necessarily have to be there in the front end, but feet on the ground is also required. But I'd say the key to all this is actually making sure that you become, or you are confident enough to be, I would say, the sort of key person of influence or leader in the field you're going into or trying to go into, and bringing a differentiator to that market that somebody wants. And I always look at it like, be seen to be the person that's giving rather than asking. And, if you're in the region, you're solving problems and taking solutions to that region that needs them solutions, you're going to get far more listened to than somebody going with selling the same thing that's already there. So I think it's about picking the right right market, about picking the right opportunity, and also being sacrificing and putting yourself into that space to become the that influential person in that region.
You touched on a couple of bits there about what maybe some businesses have failed to appreciate or haven't done quite so well in, when you're saying kind of trying to sell valves to a country that's a world leader in that. As one of your roles, when I think you were working in Mexico, wasn't it? You kind of took a bit of a different role, I suppose, to describe it as a bit of like a conduit between businesses who wanted to break into Mexico and then whether it's the relevant government body, office, um, whoever it may be. So I suppose that put you kind of in a bit more of a unique position that it wasn't subjective bias, your business that you're trying to sell. You could objectively look at these other businesses that were trying to approach the market. And I imagine with that, you saw some businesses do that very well, and some businesses kind of not do that quite as well. So I suppose leaning into that experience that you had, what tips or what kind of have you seen where you've gone, you know what, actually, this is what someone did that made them really hot, ready to go into Mexico as the example here, and some other things that other businesses did were that actually weren't quite as successful or good.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, generally the smaller dynamic companies tend to be a lot more flexible to work and adapt to, overseas environments or new environments than
Yeah.
larger, right, corporations. I think that the uniqueness of the Mexico situation. I mean, I went there with a completely different remit of what I ended up doing. What that sort of was something that just happened because my previous company had been working in Mexico with the National Oil Company and had quite a lot of work there. I was quite well known anyway in Mexico through the National Oil Company. But at a time when I moved there, the country itself was going through an energy reform with a new government, and fortunately, a lot of the people I would previously work with, probably a decade before, were moving into sort of senior political roles in different areas and different organizations that were all part of this restructuring. So before it was just a state-owned oil company and the government, and that was it. But now they were obviously opening the market up for international suppliers, international bidding rounds for licensing of oil fields and all sorts of stuff. And so they had to create a regulator, had to create a hydrocarbons commission, had to create all these different things that weren't there before. So I got sort of tied up in all that, sort of effectively unknowingly initially. And of course I developed. So when the first sort of contract started to be issued, I just had the knowledge. I'd already gone through a few years of knowledge and understanding and working through all different types of contracting models and helping the government set this up. So I was just naturally being pushed by government to speak to companies to help them work through these processes. And what I learned out of that really is that the larger companies struggled significantly with trying to adapt to models
Right.
of procurement and models of structure of payments and stuff like that quite a lot. So that was something again. I was working very closely with the Department of International Trade, which was then the UK Trade and Investment. We started to work a lot with the British Chamber out there to try and how can we influence and try and structure and work more with standardization frameworks that were generally used in the UK bidding rounds, like logic and tendering, frameworks that are already there, crime and others. But so sort of effectively speaking the language that these companies were already understood, and not trying to create some sort of localized structure. Because one thing we did, or I did sort of like establish, was that Mexico for 78 years was a privately run oil and gas industry, and the services and businesses that were operating in Mexico were pretty well geared up to manage oil and gas. It wasn't like it was a new industry as such. But what they hadn't done is had all that deep water experience offshore, subsea, all the things that were developed around the world. It'd been very much predominantly onshore and a few offshore big fields. But so the transition was really in, that expertise of offshore license and drilling contracts and all around that area. And a lot of the challenges we found, or I found, was really around expectations. People thinking that they're, for a start, that the bidding dates and the process were going to actually happen on the dates they said they were, and things like this, and getting upset because they slipped by 6 months or things like this. But you've got to realize you're going into these environments where time, it has no relevance. It's a process, and if they say 6, it's going to be 12 or 18 even. And you've got to be prepared for them expectations and prepared for that. And it is a waiting game. If you're not prepared to sit and wait and develop, and sit and go with the process, there's very little chance of pushing it on. You've got to sort of just roll with the punches. You've got to have resources and commitment for the long term. It's not a good idea just to look at one project. You've got to look at it as we want to set up in that country to be a player, and not just looking at it to, look at a specific contract or win a specific scope of work, because the work and effort you put in for the chances of probably winning is going to be significant. And so, yeah, I mean, a lot of the stuff I was doing is really, being quite brutal with some of the companies and just saying, you're not going to win this, and unless you really want to be here for the long term, you're going to waste your resources and money. And the advice would be to walk away. And some of them, didn't take that advice and carried on, and regardless. But for me, it's about my sort of code of ethics is about performing and delivering, and not spending time on things that are likely to fail, but looking at fail fast mentality, where where you're potentially going to end up and potentially could take something to a successful conclusion.
So kind of picking that apart a little bit, can I get the idea that businesses need to appreciate and realize that it's not going to be an overnight quick fix, and that's kind of the same trying to get into any market, but also that um, there's some things that are in businesses' control, and there's some things that aren't, and they can't force those things. Whether it's waiting for tenders and bids to come out, whether it's kind of waiting for um, decisions by potential big customers overseas or anything like that. There's certain kind of things you can push, and then situations where you've got to kind of appreciate that it's a long process, and you're not going to get kind of a quick win out of it.
Yeah. I mean, there's two different approaches to most of these sort of developer markets. I've seen it in Southeast Asia, Middle East is very similar. If you're going into a market, like I said, selling a product that is already there, it's going to be, an uphill push
Mhm.
finish. If you're taking something which has got a USP, some patent, some, technical advantage, that's obviously easy. Really, to do that, invariably you'll need a local partner to try and deliver that. So sort of some of the areas I was facilitating is really, finding that matchmaking, finding finding the sort of key personal influencers locally to the sort of the
Yeah.
project and to be able to push it in, because then you've got an internal. I mean, I remember the amount of people used to say to me when I was living in Spain and Mexico, well, you're like a native now, but I never ever felt like a native, ever. I was always the gringo or the foreigner. It doesn't matter how good a Spanish you speak, whether and whether you live there and have 10 children of the same culture, you're still a Brit and an expat at the end of the day. So, what you have to do is remember that from the beginning, and it's about, knowing where your skill sets end and where the local skill sets begin, to be able to then carry on that relationship. And you also have to sort of go in there with a vision that in the future you might be cut out. This might be a short-term play, short-term being 5-10 years or something like that, and the local sector at some point will inevitably probably take over and cut you out. But that's a fairly high chance of that happening. So you've got to go in there with these sorts of things in mind as well, and look at it a bit, create a business plan that is structured on a sort of, I would say, a 2 to 3 year market entry strategy with a 5 to 7 year sort of, recuperate our revenue. And if it goes long, that great, that's where I would sort of say, it's all down to product, and services. Services are easy to copy. Product, if it's patterned and got USP, is a lot harder. But then product also is going to be limited with license and USP and everything else around that. So you only have a certain period of time with license agreements and stuff like this. So yeah, they're all got their ups and downs. Services you can win quick. Products tend to get, especially new technology, takes longer to get into sectors and markets. I think one thing I have learned over the last sort of 20 years is that actually overseas territories is probably a lot easier to test new products than Europe and UK.
Right.
So if you have got particularly in the offshore industry, our offshore industry is a 10 to 15 year integration process generally for new technology. There are some that get in earlier, but invariably it's quite a long game, especially anything to do with drilling or wells or subsurface. It's a fairly long game. But even renewables, I mean, we're seeing even that now with geothermal and others. It's not a quick process. You might have a silver bullet or think you have, but at the end of the day, everyone's screaming climate crisis and change and everything else, but it's all down to money. It's all down to, political drivers at the end of the day, and it takes time. But
So I hope you don't mind me saying, but I would say that you yourself, you're kind of an industry voice, a lead in kind of in the geothermal energy area, especially at the moment. There's a lot of businesses and individuals as well out there who want to get to that level, whether that's kind of based on their own knowledge and experience or the quality of the product or service that they provide. And obviously, there's no quick fix. There's nothing that can be done kind of overnight to get you to that level. But what tips would you have for anyone who is trying to become that recognized voice within their field?
yeah, I mean, obviously, you've got to be confident enough to talk about, the challenges, confident enough to talk about the successes, and be, fairly. I mean, I'm fairly straightforward and honest talking in most cases. In respect of, I'm quite happy to say that, share failures as well as the good stuff. And I think when you're doing a sort of groundbreaking or a new next generation type step into the process, you have to really sort of take that approach because we have to have a fail fast mentality. We have to, there's not an endless pit of money to be thrown at these things and developments. You've got to have a sort of cut off, and you've got to know when to walk away. And I think that sort of comes with a bit of that comes with experience. I mean, I've done the same in the younger period of life of entrepreneurialism, of thinking you've got something that's going to be a groundbreaker, and it never is, and you end up losing a lot of money trying to make it there. But I think as you get older, you learn to naturally fail faster and cut your losses and walk away or move on to the next thing. What I would suggest is don't stop. There's a lot of people who stop and after failure, after not succeeding, and don't carry on. But I think it's a good, especially when you're going overseas and looking at businesses, the reflection of why it didn't work is obviously as important as possibly it will work when you can apply that to another market or another opportunity that comes up. And but yeah, generally I think from my side, I would say, you need to make yourself I'd say, accessible. You need to make yourself, available on social media. Like I said, we didn't have social media 25 years ago when I started, but I still was able to make myself a sort of key person of influence in the area, that I was in the local. So, and again, that's through, talking at events or speaking on, opportunities for moderating or, etc. Wherever you can get yourself in front of, a area to talk about your business, your successes and what you do and what you are doing, even if it is selling valves, it's the only way you're going to get your valves above somebody else's is by making sure that the name that they're hearing is your valves and not somebody else's valves. So it doesn't have to be groundbreaking. It can be just there. We've got the AI data centers, all sorts of things are being the talk of the town at the moment in the geothermal space, being the place that we need baseload energy. But again, it's that is a very sort of complex and restricted market at the moment. It's a huge potential, but not being played out because of the billions needed to develop them, and so
Makes sense, I suppose. Like you said, and I particularly bit that I like there was the idea of kind of learning from your failings. Everyone does fail at some point, so somewhere always makes a mistake, gets something wrong. So it's learning from them um and embracing them, I suppose, is kind of as much as anything. I want to kind of an open question now, I suppose, just to try and wrap it all up there, Carl, is, and I know there could be plenty of things that you'd like to mention, but what would you say? Is there any kind of other tips or messages that you'd get across to anyone or any business who is trying to grow that international network and get themselves seen in other foreign markets?
yeah, I mean, you've got to believe you've got to do your homework. You've got to understand the market. You've got to do your homework. You've got to understand. Um, you could, like I said, it could be a really competitive, saturated market, but it doesn't mean to say you can't get into it. You've just got to make sure that the way you approach it and how you get into it is done on the basis of actually knowing what you're going into and what you're going to be prepared to face, and also make sure you've got a budget because you need to plan this. Like I said, I mean, a 5 to 7 year type business plan strategy, looking at some sort of exit after 7 years is the ideal approach with, looking to commercialize within, the first 2 years. It's very rare that any company will go into an overseas territory and be, generating revenue commercially within, under 2 years. It's if it happens through selling products and existing products in there, that's okay. That can happen. But again, if you're doing it on the basis of just selling a few products, that could be cut off tomorrow, and you're in a country, moving into a country then with no sales. So, and I've seen that happen as well. People making decisions off the back of having one contract and think that that's it. They're gonna kill everything, and
Hmm.
it doesn't happen like that. It's really these a lot of these places are looking for technical solutions. They're looking for technical services or support. And they're very quick to, once they identify what that is and how they're doing, they're very quick to build around that. And local companies will be being pushed to, overtake that market. So, and I've seen that in many cases that, so that's why I say you got to have this sort of 5 to 7 years, expectations and an exit strategy based on what if our partner or what if the license,
Hmm.
expires, decides to go in competition with us or wants to buy us out or wants to push it out of the market, because all of these things generally happen. And but I think that's you've got to look at these as short-term ventures, with a potential to build a long-term business, but look at the opportunity as a short sort of, when I say short, like I said, 5 to 7 year type focus target, to break that market and to get in there. And it might then grow longer. I have seen successful partnerships, stuff I've done previously with Petrofac and Wood and various companies like that, which, have built and grown into quite successful localized businesses.
Hmm.
But they weren't the same business they started out as, they're a
Yeah.
different bit, so.
Yeah. And it's like, I suppose it's that always thing, isn't it? What do they say? Kind of plan for the worst, hope for the best. But at least if it is a 5, 7 year job, if that's kind of the full cycle, then at least that's what you've prepared for and planned for.
Yeah,
Um,
underfunding and underfinancing the expectations is one that people, allocating, budgets to a 12-month, business case. It's, you can read into and see as flaws before you even start, because it takes you 6 months to set a company up and, and then all these sorts of things. So it's like, it's not realistic to think, go in there and win a load of contracts within 12 months. And, so I think, again, it takes planning. And I would suggest, working with local partners, or having at least a local, lead influencer on the ground who or has somebody has a sort of name in the market and is well known, can open doors and get to the right people that are needed. If they're there, because they're not always there. If you're taking a new product, then you might not have that knowledge base in the
yeah.
region. And so, then you are on a bit of a back foot, and a lot of it then is sort of, just trying to get yourself in front of the right people. And that's normally done through speaking at events, presentation at events, and talking and networking events and stuff like that. So
I, from my point of view, that's probably kind of a perfect piece of insight and advice to end it on. I know we're kind of with that half hour there is absolutely flown by, and I know kind of we've just chipped away at the surface there, Karl. So what I would say, if anyone wants to hear any more from Karl or find out more about his experience or the work he's currently doing in geothermal, then we'll put a link to your LinkedIn page and website and stuff in the bio as well. So people, by all means, please, I'm sure Karl will not mind if you have a look and kind of reach out on anything that you may have. But last thing from me to say is thank you very much, Karl, for joining me this morning. I hope everyone's kind of found that as useful as I have, in terms of getting a bit more of an understanding of what it actually takes to be successful in these markets and build that reputation. If you want to hear more of Horizon Podcast, then by all means have a look on all your usual podcast software providers, whether that's Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube, and the likes. And also, if you want to hear more about international trading from Horizon in general, then by all means, you can follow the link in the bio to sign up for our weekly newsletter. But thank you very much, Karl. Been a pleasure.
thank you.
And thank you very much for everyone for listening. I hope to see you again on a podcast soon. Goodbye.